Okay, all right, cool. All right, thank you so much. So without further ado, may I please request the first affirmative speaker to open the floor?
Hello, I'm audible.
Is first step speaker ready? Yeah, you are. Yeah.
Hello.
Okay.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah, cool.
All right, I'm gonna start in a bit. Three, two. So I think emphasis means three things. Number one, that these movements view these things as far more important. That your individual rights preceded the collective group rights that would have otherwise spread. We prefer a world in which we had the narrative that the group rights would come first. Secondly, it means priority. It means that you dedicate a significantly greater amount of resources towards these things, to things like maybe your media channels, whatever political capital that you had, whatever political representation that you had, for the protection of individual rights and their legislation versus group rights instead. Thirdly, is that these things like by time come first. They're the prerequisite, and therefore we should have individual rights be committed before we take on any further group rights. What is the comparative? I think we prefer a world in which we had instead emphasized collective rights. Things like collective bargaining, the right to organize groups, the right to strike, the right to make protests, and not only that they be afforded, but that we expand the capacity for individuals to avail of these rights, regardless of things like the corporations not wanting them to do so, things like larger societal pressures, etc. I'm going to argue two main things. Number one, that individual rights have privileged the most privileged within minority groups, and therefore have left out the people who are more vulnerable. And take note, they can't just say that there's a lesser number of people and therefore are less important, because the entire point of caring about social movements is precisely prioritizing first the vulnerability that exists for individuals before the sheer number of the people who will benefit. There are four reasons as to why this happens. The first is that with weak collective bargaining rights, we must ask, who has the capacity to strike? Who has the capacity to protest? It is most definitely not the black worker, who is far more vulnerable in their work, rather than the white worker, who is far more likely to be able to be protected by their union because they probably already are, or probably because they were already allowed to organize within their corporation when a lot of individuals were not. I would say the ability to enact, to speak out, and do any meaningful things towards social change were already structured in such a way that they harm individuals within movements who are far more likely to be vulnerable. Secondly, it is that individual rights are ones that are afforded precisely for the rather afforded precisely to the most privileged within these groups. And I would make the simple claim that there is no accountability structure for a lot of movements, for a lot of organizations, because it's precisely based on the privilege of individuals who know they have the political capacity to speak out, who know they have the resource to be able to speak out, and therefore are far more likely to have that kind of voice. I would say the formalization of a lot of collective bargaining rights, the formalization of organization, of movements, of protests, are far more likely to lead to democratic structures that allow people at the bottom to hold people at the top accountable, rather than depending on them because they're the only ones who have the political resources, because they have the individual rights, because they have the least amount of offense towards their individual rights, and therefore they should have the capacity to do it. Thirdly, is that individual rights, even if you can legislate them, still depend massively on your context and the capacity for enforcement. What does this mean? We have afforded the right to abortion for many years. We have afforded the right to do many and exercise many individual freedoms, but a lot of the time they can only be accessible to women who are in, for example, more liberal areas, who are more urbanized areas, rather than women in the deep south or rural areas then. I would say then a poor individual has little protection, because that means that they rely on their own individual freedom, their own individual capacity to negotiate against higher powers, because that is precisely how these rights are constructed, rather than a greater collective bargaining rights. And this is important to note, because the moment in which a lot of these more privileged members of social movements can attain the individual rights that they want, that kills the impetus for a lot of further collectivization, further organization, meaning that poor individuals, more vulnerable individuals, have no one to back them in the instance that people prioritize individual rights. So if rich and more privileged gay individuals can access marriage, but people who are still structurally denied of it because of the enforcement in their own local states are unable to access it, there's no reason for them to care. One, because there's no accountability structures I have previously mentioned, but two, because it relies on your own individual ability to access these rights. Lastly, a lot of these individual rights, I would just point out, are contentious. It is things like marriage, which is not en masse supported by a lot of LGBT groups. Not because they don't think that like marriage or that the love is wrong between LGBT individuals, but they think it's a concession that the larger structure of marriage, which is hierarchical and patriarchal, would say then that it is something that is okay to concede to. I think a lot of the ability to question a lot of these individual rights are lost in the instance that minority individuals within these minority movements are far less likely to have any capacity to have meaningful change mechanisms for action. So it's things like the Me Too movement, particularly a significant number of white women, lobbying for greater capacity for police like presence, precisely because they rely on them for greater ability to report, etc., when that disproportionately harms Black women. You do that because you want a greater protection of your own individual rights. But I think with the loss of collective bargaining, there's far less likely the ability for you to have discussions about it, far less likely you can hold individuals accountable for the reasons in which they have these kinds of lobbying power. Two key pieces of framing. Number one, a lot of these groups don't even necessarily prioritize these rights. Particularly, I would say things like the ability to get a higher wage, the ability to have police reform are not rights, and they're definitely not individual rights. But they cannot be afforded by an individual right versus the greater power of collective bargaining and the ability for individuals to be able to say, we will lobby government, we will protest until we get structural reforms. So you don't allow this to happen when other individuals have a greater degree of power can exercise their rights freely, but the people who cannot do these things are unable to do so. More so, I would say the exercise of your individual freedom is a highly privileged act. It comes at the cost of broader structural reform, which again are not necessarily rights, but can only happen with the more flexible nature of collective bargaining, the ability to use leverage and get concessions, which cannot happen on their side because it's been massively deprioritized. I think then a lot of these individual protections not only created an incredibly privileged movement, but continue to protect an incredibly privileged movement with little means of recourse for a lot of the more vulnerable individuals. Secondly, were they far more likely to lead to a future, like future freedoms, future individual rights as a prerequisite, had we prioritized this first, had we made this the importance and premium in the movement, for three reasons. Number one, you get more critical mass the moment in which people feel like they have a capacity to make any meaningful change within movements because they know they might not have the ability to speak out largely on media, but they know that they can protest. They know that they can join a union that is far more likely to protect these groups and therefore far more likely to be powerful. Secondly, they're far more likely to be intersectional. It is precisely the group differentiated nature of individual rights that means that things like LGBT marriage might be good for the LGBT community, but does not necessarily help all other movements. I would make the claim that the expansion of collective bargaining, the expansion of the right to strike and the right to protest is the only way to get meaningful collaboration between already vulnerable, like minority groups and social movements, to be able to collect whatever limited and scarce resources they had to lead to further and further change. Thirdly, it is that they're perceived as illegitimate. It is because individuals say now that they are not representative of the greater whole, that there are no means for them to have to come to power or no ways to hold them democratically accountable, that when any meaningful person or figure within this kind of movement is far more likely to be able to want to lobby change, it's likely that people can say that they don't represent a greater whole, that there's no accountability structure, or they don't have the mandate of the larger movement and therefore can be turned down. I think the formalization, a lot of this collectivization, is far more likely to lead to the perception of legitimacy and the greater ability for a lot of these individuals to act in legislation, in larger political like spheres then. Lastly, I would just say that these are the strongest ways in which they can do it, because the protection of individual rights does not lead to a greater ability to be able to reform structures and create change. Unlike collective bargaining, which necessarily gives you leverage, unlike strikes, unlike protests that I'd say are far more likely to create some degree of meaningful change, I'm very proud to propose.
All right, that acknowledges the first affirmative speaker. May I please request the first negative speaker to take the floor?
Can you hear me?
Yep, you're audible. Yeah, go ahead, please.
All right. Let's start with some framing. These social justice movements are pretty smart and tend to know what's probably best for them. That's one, because they exist within the particular space that they exist and the one that they seek to change. They know the norms of society they're in, they know the nature of the problem, they know the barriers to them achieving those things. And they also know exactly what it is they're working with. So they're pretty smart, they probably know what they're doing. Second of all, they have good deliberation mechanisms. That's because they discuss things, etc. They've maybe even had this very debate amongst themselves many times over the past century. Third of all, they have experience. They've tried things, some things have failed, some things have worked. They've probably diverted their energy to the things that succeeded more than those that failed in the future times. So basically, remember that this debate is retrospective, and side negative supports history as it happened. That is, we supported these groups making these particular decisions in a way that was probably logical at the time. And basically what this has looked like over history is mostly a focus on individual rights and individual liberties and freedoms and things like self-actualization. But sometimes they do support group rights. But when they support group rights, it tends to be those like the right to protest or whatever in the context of helping gains in individual rights. We support a history that is successful and bright and looks towards a brighter future. Side affirmative deals in speculation. I'll start with some extraneous rebuttal. One major thing where they say basically how individual rights are quite privileged, but like, why aren't group rights privileged? Like, because often in these particular groups, power is concentrated within certain groups. Note, for instance, the way that the queer community in a lot of Western societies seems to have like just an enormous racism problem. Like in Sydney, every year, huge amounts of cops march in Mardi Gras when there's just like an absurd amount of crimes against humanity committed by them against Indigenous people, and that tends to lock out Indigenous people and just like all other sorts of people of color out of this. So, it's like these sorts of like group organizations, power is concentrated in them, in like high ups in unions or whatever. And so when they say like, on negative, there's no accountability structure within that, like on their side, they don't get any accountability mechanisms. Like the organizers are the ones who have jobs and clout, and they're probably not the ones who are intersectional. They say like, there are sort of elections within these organizations, but these are flawed. One, because they're probably designed by the people who started the organizations, are the most powerful, the most wealthy, whatever. But second of all, because they do have that power, they're far more likely to be elected because they can do better campaigns, because they're able to organize infrastructure to get elected, etc., etc. So when they say like, well, these norms of individual freedom lock out poor people, for instance, poor women who are unable to access abortions in rural areas of America, one, how do they access organizations on your side if they're isolated in incredibly sexist communities and stuff like that? But second of all, we think individual freedoms are better because they are universal. That is, if this person is not a member of that particular group, individual freedoms extend to everyone, and it's considered an aberration that someone outside of that movement is being excluded because they deserve their rights, rather than people asking questions about if they had their membership or whatever. So two bigger points in this speech. First of all, why group rights are worse. Second of all, why group rights are harder to get in the first place. Why group rights are worse. It's worth noting that group rights don't really have any value in themselves. That is, they're purely instrumental. And that's because we think rights derive from some sort of irreducible human dignity that individuals have, but it's unclear where this resides in groups. A group is just like a sort of collection of individuals that have some relationship to each other. There's no sort of like, I don't know, like magic there or anything. Groups are only as important as their constituent individuals. In sum, the debate should be adjudicated on who best delivers individual rights. So why are group rights a particularly unwieldy way to get individual rights? 5 reasons. 1, you need a group. The problem is that many people simply do not have access to a large enough group. For instance, poor black people in rural Alabama, or a closeted lesbian even in a city that has a flourishing like gay movement or something like that. So often there is a group, but so many people are excluded from this group that often that group is unable to lobby for them, or any group rights that are obtained by that group and not people on the outside of it. Second of all, these like group rights may be used, but only for the benefits of people within that in-group. That is, it does not benefit those people on the outside. Third of all, you need mass agreements. That is, it's really hard to rally everyone together because assuming their case, if it includes everyone of all these incredibly diverse backgrounds, well, how are you going to get them to agree on everything? It's far easier to mobilize people on issues of individual rights. Fourth of all, even if group rights are good, individual rights entail group rights far better than group rights entail individual rights. Remember that this debate applies retrospectively, and that things like suffrage or freedom of speech or even education or having a job are not things that side affirmative can assume. And basically you need these things in order to like get protesting in the first place. You need people to see you as being like humans in the first place. They need to recognize your humanity before they give you any sorts of group rights. And they say, well, you need to protest to get rights. But it's like the first protest, like by people like suffragettes or like anti-slavery crusaders, like they were illegal. We can have protests on our side as well, right? And the thing is like, yeah, basically, the thing is, once individual rights are recognized, you then are better able to get group rights. So the focus on individual rights is pretty justified. But also, once you obtain all the individual rights you need, group rights become quite obsolete because simply group rights are only useful in as much as they deliver individual rights, And they say, well, their last sort of push is to say, well, you get some sort of like things from group rights that aren't individual rights. You get things like higher wages in negotiations or whatever. But it is a simple truth that if you have more individual rights, you have more power, you're more respected in society, you're better able to negotiate things. If you don't negotiate perfectly, you can still get way higher wages on our side where you're still respected, where you're not victims of things like wage gaps. Fifth reason why group rights are unwieldy way to get individual rights is it's easier for the government to infringe upon group rights because what they can do is undermine the particular organizations. For instance, in Australia, there was a royal commission into unions, which was basically just like a political witch hunt, just trying to dismantle the power of people of working class. But if you go against individual rights, which tend more to be enshrined in things like constitutions or legal decisions, it's far harder to challenge those. That's why group rights are particularly bad ways of ensuring individual rights and anything else for that matter. Last of all, why group rights are harder to obtain. Historically and right now, there are many reasons for this. This point is divided into two parts. The first is simply it is harder to get buy-in from members of that group, simply because there are really high costs to buying into particular social movements. That is, there is risk of violence against you, but also humiliation or the fact that your boss at work might find out and fire you or something like that. And it's also worth noting here that many people of these particularly disadvantaged groups simply do not have much that they can afford to lose. And basically you need to give people something, you need to offer something directly to them in order to get them to join in. And individual rights is far better than simply being a membership of a big community, simply because many people simply want rights for themselves. A lot of people, if you are the poorest of the poor, you cannot afford to be altruistic to others. You have to prioritize your own well-being sometimes. But it's also the case that simply many people do not want ongoing participation in these particular groups. For instance, someone who is gay may not want to define themselves forever and ever as being a member of the gay group. They just want to be treated like a regular human and go on with their life. And we think by offering them these rights as a sort of one-off easy thing, it's easier to attract people that may not be radicals, but are people who would get involved otherwise. So it's far easier to get buy-in from your group if you offer them individual rights. But second of all, it's far easier to persuade people to give you your rights, people from outside that group, simply because the rhetoric of collectivization is often terrifying to hear. It attracts aggression in response and it alienates potential allies, because what it does is it necessarily depicts you as being other. You say, we are different, we have our own separate political structure and stuff like that. And often it is seen as being giving collective rights to certain groups of people is being seen as giving them special privileges rather than giving them the rights that they deserve like everyone else. Compare this to rights discourse, which fits far better into the rhetoric of the oppressors. For instance, things like religious discourse is often really focuses on the sanctity of the individual. And if you use that rhetoric with individual rights, that's far easier than with collective rights, which appear in very few sacred texts. But also in just simply mainstream liberal discourse, which talks heaps about the individual and very little about the communal. If you say we deserve these individual rights, it's easy to persuade people to get on your side. Admittedly, in this debate, many countries are illiberal, but even in illiberal countries, collectivization is seen as a threat because you're setting up alternative power bases that could be used to rival power, whereas individual rights are far more palatable to those who are in power. But also you're simply more likely to get more empathy and solidarity from allies, and you're more relatable, simply because it is easier for them to conceive of their own individual rights being they conceive of their own individual rights. It's easier for them to imagine being a person who has their rights restricted rather than these strange sort of amorphous communal things that don't really apply. In sum, group rights are really hard to get and are only useful in as much as they deliver individual rights. Thus, the affirmative takes a circuitous and diversionary path that simply gets what we get on side negative, but it gets them worse and slower and may not even get them at all. That's why we're proud to stand on the side of a successful history.
All right, I'll acknowledge the first negative speaker. May I please request the second affirmative speaker to take the floor?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yeah, everything's fine. Please go ahead.
Let me just, I'll just fix my notes.
Yeah, cool.
Ladies and gentlemen, if we step out the liberal bubble of the Western world and look at how developing countries or generally other societies operate, it is not true that there was a success for the social movement. Note that the claims that they make are exactly the problem. The vast majority of the privileged might be able to enjoy these gains at best, but everyone else is left out by the system. That is why the true nature of a social movement, which is to collectivize the different interests of individuals, is better done on our side. The first thing I want to respond to is their claim that social collective rights are only instrumental. I agree that there's a degree that there's instrumental. That is to say, collective rights help you lead to individual rights. But I also think there's an inherent value to collective rights, right? In the same way, we believe that the ability for you to speak out, the ability for you to associate is part of your identity and part of your humanity as human beings are social individuals. There's an inherent value to being able to collectivize as a group. There's an inherent value of creating your own identity as an individual and being able to relate to one another. It is unclear this is an only instrumental right, and insofar as negative is not able to recognize that, we take the debate already. But let's assume for their side of the house, the framework that these are just instrumental rights. Why are we still better? The first issue I want to deal with is whether or not this creates stronger or weaker social movements. The first claim that they make is that collective bargaining makes people less likely to want to participate. And the reason for it is that they say that they care more about individual rights that they're able to gain and therefore don't want to care about the hassle of participating in a collective group. A couple of responses. One, it assumes that the individual rights that you determine to give them are things that they actually want. Miko pointed out how a lot of individual rights are contentious between multiple different minorities. For example, things like gay marriage. For example, things like abortion. And the problem when you emphasize individual rights is that the collective determination of what those individual rights starts to diminish because your systems like collective bargaining, your systems like needing to organize, your systems like cooperating with one another diminish, and therefore it's unclear that the individual rights will be representative under your side. But secondly, know that if your claim is individual rights, the analysis coming from my previous speakers that collective rights allow you to access more individual rights and more accurate individual rights in the future. And to a degree that is true, to a degree the incentive for people to join is the promise for change. We promise a greater degree of change under our side of the house, and therefore we get more people to join in. But lastly, it's just asserted that people don't want to participate in collective movements. Assuming both sides of the house are not able to fight for rights, there's an inherent value to being part of a community that you as a minority are likely to want. Things like the safe space that you have in the feminist movement, things like the safe space you have among the queer community, which allows you to be yourself, to feel protected, and to be with other individuals. Know that the emphasis on collective rights is more likely to get this. One, because it comes from the philosophy of collective rights, which is that individuals as a group ought to band together and support one another because we are one individual identity. To a degree that is true, it's far more likely to listen to individuals versus the philosophy of individual rights, which is inherently individualistic, where our stories are different and therefore our ability to empathize and collectivize with one another is different. But secondly, the fact that collective rights requires people to mobilize as a group means that there's just far more interactions for people to feel like they belong. So to a degree that people are quote unquote deterred by participating in the movement, we would suggest it's far greater under our side. But the last thing I want to note is, to a degree what they say is correct, which is people join in the movement to get what they want, and then ultimately exit out of the movement when they don't get what they want, is ultimately damaging to their case. And the reason for this is, presumably privileged individuals will get what they want first for the reason that they have more access to resources, more political capital, more political power. And to a degree that this is true, the individual participation of privileged members who are essential for getting change will only be insofar as they get the individual rights that they want, but not the individual rights that other individuals want. And the point where they get it already, using their own analysis, they're likely to pull out of the movement and therefore not able to get the support that you want. So at best, you get rights for privileged individuals, but under your side of the house, the underprivileged individuals are not able to get the same protections. The comparative here is, to a degree, you believe that collective rights are important, and your ability for you to exercise any particular right is through collective rights, and you enter the movement on the perspective of you want to fight for the collective as a whole. That means even if privileged individuals get what they want already, there's still an incentive for them to continue fighting. And this is important because they're not likely to get us change in the very first place. Next thing they then say is that individual rights are far more likely to be representative of your wants. Okay, there's a difference between individual rights as a collective and the specific individual rights people necessarily want. They don't explain why one claim for individual rights will represent everyone's particular interest. In fact, the converse is particularly true. We said collective bargaining rights are far more likely to apply to multiple different contexts. That a lot of movements want to fight for protest. A lot of movements want you to be able to get things like collective bargaining, not only one labor union in one industry, but all the other labor unions. And this is important because even if you believe that within the movement, the change is symmetric, the fact that under your side of the house, individual social movements are different from one another is exactly the problem, right? Because if you fight for things like gay marriage, there's no reason as to why the Black Lives Matter movement would necessarily care about that. Or if you fight for things like abortion, it's not clear why workers' unions will necessarily care about that. And to a degree, there are differing interests. It's harder to get solidarity and support between different groups in comparison to our world, where collective rights are likely to benefit everyone. Everyone wants the right to protest. Everyone wants the ability for them to participate in rallies. This is important because at best, Only the strong social movements and opposition are able to be successful. Those who combine political capital and support. But under our side of the house, we're far more likely to include the weaker social movements who don't have the same capital and support. The last thing they then say is you're able to get more allies under their side of the house because people see greater similarities with individual rights. This again assumes that the individual rights that you're fighting for are similar to the individual rights that they crave. It is unclear why a man would care about abortion rights of a particular woman because they can't necessarily foresee the similarities or the necessity for abortion, or things like minimum wage in a particular right, or things that you don't necessarily see to be particularly important, in comparison to the fact that the right to protest, which I think everyone, even if you're relatively privileged society, would want to have because there are some problems that they want to fight for and therefore able to collectivize. These things are far more similar to the experiences of other individuals, and that's why we're able to get the change under our side of the house. Next then, where are we likely to become more accessible, which is the other claim that you want to fight for in the day's debate. The first thing they say is that individual rights will not benefit. Collective rights means that they say that collective rights are unfair because there's still privilege and power relationships in collective rights. We agree to the extent that this is true, but it has to be a comparison, right? To a degree, we believe that union leaders might sometimes be powerful, might sometimes be corrupt. At least they have an incentive to listen to people because the collective bargaining right only works and can only be exercised if everyone else supports it. If they claim that people who compose the social movements are smart, then there are other analysis about why election systems don't work or why people will just be pressured and influence the election system doesn't apply. But secondly, marginally at least we have greater capacity for us to check and balance these individuals, and that's why we're likely to get change. The next thing they then say is, the individual rights were the prerequisite for us to get all the rights we want right now. So the right to suffrage, right to free speech, etc., etc. I'm actually uncertain whether this falls under the collective rights or the individual rights, because whether or not you're able to vote is only important if it's exercised in the collective. But to a degree, the right to suffrage just fought under things like protests, people rallying with one another, holding arms, and lobbying for this change. That just proves that the collective rights were the prerequisite for individual rights, and therefore able to get the change that we want under their side. But lastly, this debate is not only about being able to fight for rights. We would suggest that the ability for you to fight for other things that are not necessarily rights are greater in a world where you have things like greater collective bargaining and rallying. This is things like higher wages. This is things like greater working conditions. This is things like reforming the police structures, because now you have a capacity for you to have a democratic voice or a democratic say. Note that when individual rights are fought for, at the point where you're able to receive it already under their side, the movement starts to dissipate. The movement no longer needs to fight for particular things. And to a degree, these are not considered rights. The incentive for them to fight for these things no longer happens, but a collective movement is able to fight for these things because they already have the power and the capacity to do so under our side of the house. At the end of this debate, this makes movements weaker, this makes movements less inclusive, and this makes movements less able to fight for other things that are not just rights. And that's why we're very proud to affirm. Thank you.
All right, the House acknowledges the second affirmative speaker. May I please request the second negative speaker to take the floor?
Speaker, I think it's telling that this affirmative team doesn't give you a single example of what a group right actually is, except for nebulous notions of the right to protest or the right to collectivize, right? Because in this debate, we tell you that individual rights are things like the right to suffrage, certain human rights, things like the right to equal pay, the right of trans people to ask for things like gender neutral bathrooms in public spaces. And we tell you all of those things bring very concrete benefits to those groups of people and are things that are important in their everyday lives. And that means that this debate probably looks something like this. Should the Black Lives Matter movement continue to push for the enforcement of individual rights that empower African-American people and end things like police brutality? Or should they push to collectivize, they have some kind of formalized structure through which they can articulate those particular thoughts? And that's the comparative that this affirmative team doesn't engage with, and it's the reason why they are losing this debate. I'm going to ask 3 questions in this speech. The first one is, in what circumstances do people push for individual rights, and when do social justice movements pursue them as objectives they want to achieve? The second one is, what does this do for privileged voices in the debate? And the final one is about then what this means for group rights and individual rights as a way up. So, first question in this speech, in what circumstances do social justice movements push for these individual types of rights? I think the first thing that needs to be noted in this debate is that empirically, unions already exist in a large number of places. And that's important important in this debate because I think insofar as you're talking about social justice movements, that necessarily mitigates a lot of the benefits that this affirmative team wants to bring you. Because in places where union apparatuses already exist and things like collectivized action already exist, it necessarily means that the push for things like individual rights has to be more important. We think in all of those parts of the world, we're necessarily winning. The next claim they make here, though, is just to say things like, well, often individual rights aren't actually in the interests of the people in that particular movement. To which we say that's simply not responsive to the material we give you in Mark about why social justice movements are very good at assessing their own interests because they are comprised of the people that want those particular rights and outcomes. And that's to say that if you are in the developing world and you are part of a social justice movement in that particular country, you are likely someone who is affected and is disenfranchised and disempowered. And that means that the way you construct your social justice movement in terms of the priorities that you afford to different rights is likely to be in your interests and in your favor. And we never get any analysis from this affirmative team to tell us why that is not the case. So I think at the end of this, it means that people that are involved in these movements push for individual rights where it is in their interest to do so. So if you are a feminist that does not support abortion, for instance, you would not partake in the conversation about abortion. You would choose to opt out of that because it was not an individual right that you felt was meaningful or valuable to you. Similarly, if you are a trans person in the LGBT movement, you would not push for individual rights such as the right to same-sex marriage if that's not something that you cared about. And note that then social justice movements can form around those particular interests that different groups of people have and campaign for them at large. And no, given that they depend upon mass support and mass movements, we think that in the cases where then you are campaigning for individual rights, they are probably popularly supported by the people in those movements who necessarily get that benefit. So having established that, second question in this speech, what does this do for privileged voices in the debate? Because the main harm that's presented by this affirmative team is simply that privileged voices dominate these particular social justice movements, and you need to have kind of formalized collective action or union-like structures to overcome it. I think the first thing to note is that this is probably true of some movements, but not of others, right? So in those movements where this is not the case, I don't think this harm necessarily stands. For example, you might say that trans people are marginalized within the LGBT movement because that's something that a lot of people in that movement have expressed to feeling, but you might say that privilege operates in different ways in a movement like Black Lives Matter, so necessarily they get no benefits in those types of movements. And no, given they have to support regretting this on the whole, that means the margins of the benefits they get are significantly reduced, and the benefits we bring you necessarily stand. The next thing to note, though, is that they never explain to you why it is that privileging of certain voices is in all instances harmful. Like in some cases, it might be harmful where it locks other people out, but often there might be an overlap between interests that different groups have. So a good illustration of this might be the fact that there is often a critique made of the feminist movement that like it focuses on the interests of white women. But if you take something at a very basic level of something like the pay gap, for instance, pushing for equal pay is still something that affects all women, even if it affects them differentially, right? So you might say, well, it's true that white women make the most money, and so them demanding to get equal pay doesn't really reflect how disadvantaged you are as a Latina woman, for instance. But when you campaign for something like equal pay, you necessarily get flow-on benefits because you can also say that other women deserve that right to be empowered too. I don't think we get any analysis to prove that's harmful. The final thing to note here, though, is that the exact same problems of privilege apply in their version of the world. Why was that? The first one was that disprivileged groups couldn't access organized structures in the way that they wanted them to, and there were often higher barriers to entry. So in the case of unions, for instance, things like having to pay a union membership fee, things like having to work in a particular profession to be entitled to enter it, things like geography, which means that if a union is not in your city, you cannot partake in it, right? Which means that all the disprivilege they want to care about manifests on their side of the house as well, and in more pernicious ways, because you can't just engage in Black Lives Matter on the internet, you have to attend a Black Lives Matter meeting at which you put yourself in the minutes and have your particular opinion expressed. The second thing to note, though, is that within an organized structure, it becomes easier for privileged groups to abuse disprivileged groups because you can blame silencing of those people on organizational structure. Things like, I'm the president, therefore I get more speaking time. Things like, we need to allocate a meeting and items of minutes and an agenda that we have to stick to in the interests of our organization. But the final thing to note is that you're likely to feel the same feelings of being being locked out. And indeed, it's more intimidating because now it's not just a conversation you can participate in at your will with as much or as little involvement as you want. There are formalized structures that you have to engage in. But finally, so when they say things like some rights harm other people, like white women wanting more police in response to Me Too harms Black women, those same things still happen, but they now happen through formalized institutional structures that lock these people out. Why then do we say that group rights are objectively worse? The first thing we tell you is that they're often much harder to achieve. And no, we don't get any response to this material. We tell you that's for a couple of reasons. The first is that you require agreement and homogeneity between groups that are involved to be able to get particular outcomes. And that looks like needing all women to agree on a particular policy within your union or your collective action before you can actually get any change about it, and not accounting for the disparate views that they might have, which necessarily stifles change. Secondly, we tell you that it doesn't play into broader narratives that other people subscribe to, particularly people in power, that say things like you should be entitled to things like suffrage or equal pay because I want those things for myself. And finally, we tell you that it feels like giving power to a group of people and that is threatening. So if this debate does just take place in the developing world, where like they are dominated by elites and people in positions of power of government, there is no world in which they let you build your like incredibly powerful trade union to fight against that particular government and campaign for all the rights they think are so important. But secondly, even if that's not true and you get the rights to begin with, we tell you it's harder to enforce them. And that's because of things like infighting and disagreement between your members, but also because it's so easy to undermine the power of that group by disenfranchising them. Like you have unions, but you give them very small amounts of power that means they can't meaningfully make change, like happened in countries like Australia, or you use rhetoric that can apply against that union as a whole. For example, you discredit them and diminish them in the eyes of the populace, which makes it hard to get the changes that they think are oh so important. So I think that in the best case for this affirmative team, in some circumstances, you get some forms of collective action, but it's never good collective action. It's often not going to be in the interest of the disprivileged people they want, and often it's going to be much, much worse than the comparative. That doesn't even engage with the retrospective aspect of this debate that Mark brings you, which we're necessarily already winning. We oppose.
All right, that was acknowledges the second negative speaker. May I please request the third affirmative speaker to take the floor?
Seen and heard.
Yeah, you're audible. Yes. Yes.
All right, instead, sorry. Okay. Three, two, one. Two issues in this debate. Firstly, where do we help the most vulnerable individuals? Secondly, which is better, which leads to more rights in the future and more different rights, which is easier to access. First, where do we help the most vulnerable individuals? Because the first thing they say is group rights are privileged. It leads to it's still going to be privileged equally on our side. This isn't true. The reason it's currently privileged, the reason unions are currently privileged and our unions are mostly white, is specifically because of the lack of collective bargaining rights, the lack of group rights that currently exist, right? These make it so that it's harder for minorities who have like less secure jobs to be able to access unions. It's harder for minorities to be able to access these partnerships with the Black Lives Matter movement and join those movements and all these things. It's harder for people with less workplace protections, and it's much easier for those who are privileged to do so. This is why unions are currently privileged. If on our side, we're able to get better collective bargaining rights, which means it's much more accessible for people to join these movements, there's much less union fees and all these things, it's much easier for people to collect, it's much easier for these movements to become less privileged, actually cater to the individuals on our side as opposed to what you get on their side. Second level of response, right? Because even if it's privileged, at least we're able to hold these groups much more accountable. Even if the leader is white, the point at which you have more black individuals or more individuals from a minority being within that union or being within that movement means that you're forced to succumb to them, right? Because you still need their votes for the election. So you're more likely to like take the things that they want onto your platform rather than what you get on their side, where you only fight for the individual rights of the people who are within the union, which are the people that are the most privileged, not the people that you want to actually cater to. Thirdly, on our side, you can at least hold them accountable. If they ignore you as a black individual, they ignore the things that you want, you can hold them accountable to the point at which you're able to join the collective bargaining movements, you're able to join the discussion, right? You can call them out in the media. You can make your own group against their group and say that what their group is doing is actually harming your group and doing all of these things, right? Which all shows that collective bargaining fixes the problem that currently exists, that you like have privileged movements and all these things. That's much more likely on their side. So when they said that you have a barrier because you have union fees and you have geography, those things only exist because of the lack of emphasis on group rights. It's so much more likely that with less union fees, because the government like regulates them less, and because there's less regulations and there's more group rights, it means that these unions have to charge these people a lot less. It means that there's more support for unions from the government, means that it's much more accessible to a lot of people. This means it's so much more likely that collective groups are able to exist even in rural communities and communities all over where currently they are geographically locked. On their side, that's what they need to contend to, the geography locking or the high union membership fees that stop people from entering the movement and all of these things. On our side, you have to recognize it's so much more likely if you fought for group rights, these barriers wouldn't exist and you would have communities in all of these areas. And how does this trickle down to the other arguments that they said? Because they said most people are excluded from groups. Black individuals in the rural South can't join any group. I think firstly, on our side, if we gave the emphasis to group rights, it's so much more likely that these individuals would be able to join, right? Because they can make their own collective right, a collective group, for example, their own movement within the rural South, because it's now much easier and much more accessible. Their employers can't block them anymore. Government regulations or racist government officials can't block them anymore because there's more group rights. It's so much more likely black individuals in the rural South on their side are unable to do anything about the situation. Because look at it. They said individual rights would benefit everyone. But we told you from the start that literally individual rights don't benefit people because it relies on your individual capacity to ascertain those rights or to get those rights. If you're a woman who lives in the rural South, you still can't get abortions even if it's in the law that you should be able to get abortions because people would harass you, because people block out the abortion clinics and do all of these things. It's unlikely that a rural black individual would be able to access the rights that they fight for, the individual rights, as opposed to on our side, where at least you're able to get a movement, at least you're able to collectivize because of group rights. And this means, firstly, you're much more able to be able to access those individual rights. Because the point at which you're in a group, it's harder for them to block you, it's harder for them to silence you, so you're able to get those group rights. But secondly, even if you don't get those group rights, at least you have a safe space, at least you have a group you're able to connect with. On their side, they have no benefit largely to a lot of these individuals, and they weren't even able to respond to our analysis in this situation. The next thing they said is unions already exist. I don't know why this is true. In majority of the developing world, union busting is completely legal and completely allowed, and majority of countries are unable to form meaningful unions because of this situation. Secondly, because of the backsliding of democracies, right? In majority of the world, democracies are backsliding to be more and more right-wing and less allow these rights to currently exist, right? They use things like saying, oh, because of the coronavirus, so you can't have protests and do all of these things, which allow them to stop these group rights. Those things wouldn't have happened or wouldn't be allowed if you had much stronger group rights, much stronger protections for all of these things. But if they're saying that unions already exist, I don't know why it's fair for them to say that voting doesn't exist on our side, right? That's so completely radical. Just because you have an emphasis on one side doesn't mean you completely ignore the other side. It's like in our side, we still have the basic individual rights that we would have gotten, like voting and all these other things, even if we don't have the higher things like they wanted to say. The last thing they mentioned is people are good at deciding things. They can decide things based on their interests. They said there's no reason that we gave why these people won't be able to decide what's best for the movement. Literally, that's our entire argument. On their side, they just asserted these people are smart. These people know what they're doing. We gave you an entire argument about why they don't, right? Because they likely are privileged individuals that harm a lot of underprivileged individuals. Firstly, when weak individuals are unable to access the unions or these movements, they're unable to speak up. They're unable to say what these movements should fight for, and a lot of things that they fight for are ignored. This leads to incredibly privileged individual rights, like gay marriage and all of those things. Secondly, individual rights or individual enforcement rules rely on your political capital, your own capital, right? Because your government in the rural South could still block you from getting abortion. Because social and political pressure from your family and community can still mean that even if you're legally allowed to get abortion, you won't get an abortion. On their side, they do nothing for a lot of these most vulnerable individuals because they feel they're isolated in trying to ascertain the individual right or get the individual right. They do nothing for them to be able to access it on their side. Thirdly, we get more accountability for these people on our side because we're able to hold them accountable, because we're able to join the movements. On their side, rich people don't need to care. The point at which they pass an individual right, they're privileged enough to access it. They don't need to care about the movement. They don't need to care about accessibility. They don't need to care about the underprivileged in the group. On our side, when you're able to form stronger group rights, you force those privileged individuals to cater to even the most vulnerable individuals in the group. You force them to fight for the things that the underprivileged individuals want to fight for. first level of even if they get more individual rights, we told you, a lot of individual rights actually harm other members of the community because of how privileged they are. For example, the right to change your gender in government documents only after surgery harmed every other trans individual that wanted to be able to change their gender pre-surgery, right? And it even made the discrimination worse because people say, why don't you just get surgery? Because then these people aren't able to access it. Things like LGBT marriage strengthens the narrative of the heteronormal narrative. Things like white women wanting to empower police, but it actually harms black women. A lot of these individual rights that these people are fighting for actually harm other individuals, but you're never able to get to the other side because they're underprivileged, because they're unable to join the movement. And we told you, there's so much more fundamental things like being able to get higher wages and all these things that they ignore on their side. Secondly, which is better for you to be able to access in this situation? We told you, they said group rights are seen as giving special rights, so it's harder to access them. Firstly, this is untrue. Group rights are rights that anyone can avail of, right? This is why even right-wing groups and left-wing groups both want the ability to be able to protest, both want the ability to have collective bargaining and all these things. It's much more likely you get no form of people going against you when you're fighting for group rights, because both sides of the political spectrum want to be able to protest more, want to be able to collective bargaining more. Secondly, it's so much more likely on their side that individual rights are seen as special privileges because they only affect people from that group. Things like gay marriage being seen as a special privilege because it only affects LGBT individuals. Things like having gender changes for trans women are seen as special privileges. Things like pregnancy leaves are seen as special privilege because they only harm women. This means you need much more political capital to be able to get those individual changes as opposed to what you have on our side. More than this, we told you, you get stronger cross-pollination across movements because everyone wants to be able to access these collective bargaining rights. That's how you get the Black Lives Matter movement working with the feminist movement, because they both want more collective bargaining rights and because they both want to have an incentive to have more protests and all of these things. The next thing they said is group rights are easier to curtail because individual rights are enshrined in the Constitution. This is highly untrue. It's so much more likely, given their own context of liberal democracies, that that group rights are enshrined in the Constitution. Individual rights are subjective applications of the Constitution, like saying that marriage needs to apply to every single individual, whereas other people would say it doesn't. It's much less likely it's enshrined clearly in the Constitution as opposed to group rights on our side. We told you, group rights are so much more important because they lead you to more ability to access individual rights, but more than this, they lead you to the ability to have safe spaces, they lead you to the ability to even access individual rights. We don't know why those are important on their side, and they lead you to do so much more things. Thank you.
All right, House acknowledges the third affirmative speaker. Can we please have the third negative speaker?
There are two fatal flaws in this team's case. The first fatal flaw is they misunderstand the nature of symmetry in debating, because they make a series of claims. Like, for instance, they say unions have incentives to represent their members. Well, that is symmetric. Social justice movements have incentives to represent their members. They say, oh, all of the things you're talking about are controversial, like gay marriage, but there's a series of group rights which are controversial, like having an Indigenous voice in Parliament, an example in Mark's speech. And so a lot of their case, in fact, a huge amount of it, which I'm going to dissect more in a second, is predicated on very specific symmetrical claims. And the second flaw is they just do not respond to a large amount of our material, which I'm going to go through now. First question I want to look at is, what is this debate about, with two separate axes? Then I'm going to look at group rights, then I'm going to look at individual rights. Let's start with, what is this debate about? Notably, this is not a debate about individual rights good, group rights bad. This is a debate which is, the way things have happened is bad, and we regret the emphasis on individual rights. And this means that a lot of this team's claims fall out of the debate. Because when they say things like, oh, a lot of things like protest are great rights, sure, and we fought for them, we just didn't think we needed to err even more on the side of emphasizing those rights. We give you a series of reasons why the balance that was struck was pretty good. Things like the fact that they exist within that space, they have internal deliberation, they have trial and error, etc. We finally get a response at third, which is to say we asserted those things. No, I think those people living in those communities actually structurally probably know about those communities and those issues. And then the second response is not really a response, which is just to say those people are privileged. But notably, a social justice movement is a mechanism for change. So too is a collective union or bargaining agreement or whatever. Both of them have intrinsic structural agreements. This is a recurring theme in their speech, which is symmetry. The final thing they say here is everyone wants protest. Sure, everyone wants protest, which is why those things happen early. And that is, but notably in your world, in the status quo, you had to push further away from those things. The second thing I want to look at is actually a very clear and simple axis upon which we win the debate, which is retrospectively, which rights were most important at the inception of these forms of movements. We tell you that individual rights were necessary for group rights to ever come into existence. That is because of two reasons, neither of which are ever properly engaged with. The first is that the first hurdle to giving someone any form of right, including the right to protest, is you have to view them as a receptacle which can contain rights. You need to view them as a human being, which is an individual right. There is no engagement with that claim. The second one, which is given again at mark, is that there is a signaling mechanism. When you give women the right to vote, you necessarily view them as elevating their status in society to reaching a degree of humanity and personhood. That means you view them differently, which means you are more likely to beget and give them future rights. We also tell you two other responses. The first is that the initial group right, e.g. rioting, which is what they want to claim, was illegal and wasn't a right that those people actually had. And the fourth response is to say that overwhelmingly individual rights are the mechanisms for future change. The ability to vote, the ability to gain income, the ability to appear in court, etc. We get two responses from this. The first is that emphasis doesn't mean absence, but by your token from first affirmative, you're taking resources away. So that does in fact mean an absence to some extent. The second response is from second affirmative, where they simply say, well, the right to vote is not an individual vote. Firstly, read the info slide. Yes, it is. And second, clearly, you are using your own vote, your own right by yourself for your own purpose. And that's really important because it means you go back in time and this team would have suffragettes not fight for the right to vote, but instead try and fight for the right to protest. This team would have African Americans and slaves try to get the right to collectivize instead of stop being slaves. And we've given you structural reasons why that would not work. So this team actually has already lost the debate on that metric alone. They didn't engage with it properly. That's, I guess, another fatal flaw. Second claim with respect to individual rights. They make a series of claims. Let's go through them. The first thing I want to engage with is a series of claims we make that are not responded to at all. We tell you firstly that group rights are less popular. And the first reason that gets no engagement is that ongoing membership of that group can be dangerous. It is hard and dangerous to be a part of the NAACP in the rural South in the 1930s. And that is why a lot of people who are African American probably didn't want to go in and back that group and didn't want to remain a part of that group in order to avail those rights. No response throughout those speakers. We tell you a lot of other things, but another one that doesn't get any response is the fact that there is an emphasis on liberalism in the elites of colonial powers. So when this team says, no, this debate is also about the developing world, we agree, but there was entrenched colonial ideas around liberalism in those places. That's why slavery was ended in Liberia on the basis that it was also the land of the free. That is why the religious rhetoric about the individual, which is what allowed William Wilberforce to free the slaves in the 1830s. The second claim we make that gets no response is that this was less palatable to those elites. That is because there was the fear and that you were creating and emboldening a central power. And third affirmative does a lot of our work here where they say there is union busting in the developing world. Yeah, there is. That's our claim. That's bad for you because it means your central mechanism of change could structurally be attacked, which was our second claim here, that when you give power specifically to a specific collective who could avail it, it was very easy to target that. And they help us by giving that example. God, they shot themselves in the foot. The second thing we tell you is that group rights are worse for a series of reasons. The first reason is you require a concrete group. And when this team says claims like, well, maybe you don't have an abortion clinic near you in the Deep South, maybe not. But that's probably more likely than having a sufficiently large union or collective action group. And even when those groups exist, you have to still give them time and energy and union dues. And all of those things meant that proportionately those forms were less accessible. We also told you it required agreement and accord amongst those members. No response. So when Katie tells you that it's probably likely that a huge number of Indigenous voices disagree about how to actually run that group, they do not engage with it. The final thing we tell you is it is dependent upon specific institutional mechanisms, which is also not engaged with. Let's engage more with their claims then. They say unions are white overwhelmingly because there's no collective bargaining. First, but they were formed by group rights. So in your world, they still have that like they never proved that they changed the disparity within those organisms. The second thing they say is you can hold them accountable. That is clearly like symmetric in our world. You could also hold them accountable there. The second thing they say is in response to our argument about, the second thing they say is about cross-pollination, but there are a series of other incentives for different structural groups to work together, e.g. dismantling the hierarchy, but it's also never clear specifically what you wanted this to look like an LGBT union probably can't exist in specific spheres. The third thing they say is like with respect to geography and collective rights, etc. We tell you that firstly, a lot of entities don't have unions. Secondly, empowering collective rights makes those unions more powerful. And third, they never actually adequately explain geography. A lot of people are just literally locked out by the nature of their existence from availing certain things in certain places. But finally, on individual rights and privilege. The first claim here is that like same-sex marriage, there's no accountability and thus more privilege. First, that is the exact worst on your side because African Americans are locked out in labor projects. The second affirmative response is to say, no, unions have an incentive to help everyone in order to be popular. But that logic also applies to social justice movements. The difference, and the reason it's worse for them, is twofold. The first is it's less transparent once you're actually in that union or collective action group movement, as opposed to a big, broad social justice movement like Black Lives Matter. And the second is you've already fought for the power. Unions already have that entrenched power, so now they don't care as much about individual members, as opposed to a social justice movement, which has yet to achieve the thing they need to achieve. The second thing they say is that you require specific context, e.g. liberal areas for abortion. I think I've already adequately engaged with that. The third thing they say is some of this is contentious, e.g. gay marriage. Well, that ignores contentious group right projects, but broadly, because individual rights create legal and level playing fields, they are more palatable and are likely to be more engaged with. The third thing to say is that we have incentives to push for the most basic individual rights, things like suffrage, things like freedom. So at the end of this speech, and indeed this debate, this team doesn't respond to a huge amount of our material, which suggests that this is unlikely to be effective and pushes people away. They also don't engage with the nature of, like, historically what this debate is even about. For those reasons, very, very proud to oppose.
All right, the House acknowledges the third negative speaker. May I please have the negative reply?
Starting in 3. 4 areas of this speech. The first is a question of asking how these actual movements get started, because are they even able to start on side affirmative? We made a big push at first speaker, more so at second, and then also at third, which is simply you need a huge amount of individual rights to even get started before you even get collective rights, because getting collective rights is, you need to basically be seen as a human as a prerequisite to order get these sorts of collective rights anyway. And they never really answer the question of why these movements wouldn't simply be crushed as soon as they start if they don't fit into the sort of discourse of liberty or whatever as is more popular. Remember, this debate's historic, it's retrospective, they can't just pretend it's not. But then there's also a question of who they attract, because on side negative, we get way more people, because it's easier to attract people on fringes, because joining these movements is quite dangerous. They don't have much to lose. There's not much that they can afford to lose. And so, well, you need to offer them something in order to join, and that can be individual stuff, individual rights. And so they say, well, it's not ideal. They're just selfish. They're like, I don't know, they're just like bougies who leave after the job is done. But at least on our side, a job gets done. That's not what they prove. Second area of this speech is whose voices get prioritized. Because we said, in these particular groups, these organizations, they are just as liable to prioritize those who are in power as in on our side, where there's rhetoric of individual rights. And they say all this stuff about how basically like every problem that right now exists with unions is because of this norm. Every single problem. It's like we gave reasons for why the way they're going to prioritize the people who are going to, why they prioritize people who are more powerful. And then they have this sort of, like, for instance, stuff about how certain people are isolated. Like they can't rebut geography. Like there's only certain people in a certain area. They can't just say there's a union there or whatever. So affirmative fails to prove anything that is not like symmetric beyond a sort of trivial degree. But also like affirmative just needs to prove like what even is the gay union, And there's sort of a problem here about even if these people in these groups are privileged, the problem is, as I said at first negative speaker to very little response, that rights discourse is universal. So even if you have particularly bougie rights, the bougies want to enforce them everywhere, for instance, by increasing access to abortion clinics. Third question, the third area of this speech, how do they change attitudes of hegemonic groups? On our side, we said you fit into particular religious and political discourse that relates to individual sanctity and individual rights, and you're not seen as setting up a hostile, privileged opposition group. And so on our side, you're far better able to change people's minds. They say, oh yeah, there's not really much response to that, which is quite troubling. But they do say it's like a lot of group rights are actually quite popular. They're supported by the left and the right. But if they are that popular, they're going to get enacted anyway, right? So our side is the one that actually changes minds. And negative, it's worth noting throughout their entire case, does not give any mechanism of how they actually get widespread political change without changing the minds of any of those in power. And we're better at changing their minds. Last area in this speech is about which side's gains are more vulnerable to basically government stripping them away at a later date. Because we said on their side, governments have an incentive to oppose these groups and their power. That's for electoral reasons, because people see these groups as being extra privileged, opposition, enemies, and unfairly privileged. And also, the government themselves are simply threatened by the emergence of this rival power base. Especially this would be in countries that are like less democratic, you know, like, or just like the developing world examples that cite affirmative emphasize a lot. So governments have the incentive, but also governments are far better to shut down these groups and repeal group rights. That's because individual rights end up enshrined in constitutions. They say, well, they're not all in constitutions. Yeah, courts interpret the constitution, and that's basically as good as it ending up in the constitution, but also they end up in laws and legal decisions, but also they fit into a popular perception of humanity. For instance, although America may technically be able to repeal the Civil Rights Act, the fact of the matter is that the Civil Rights Act fits into every single American's perception of what it is to be human and what human rights are. And so it is politically impossible for them to get repealed because of the way that this latches on to the existing political discourse. So even if these movements are governed by the privilege, we still make individual small gains, but gains that never move backwards. So affirmative lose this debate. They fail to answer 5 questions. 1, how do these movements get started? Second of all, how do they convince people within and without to take their side? Third of all, what's the gay union? Fourth of all, how do they ensure these groups survive attempts by the government or civil society to shut them down? Fifth of all, how do they ensure any change actually lasts? History on our side is not perfect, but it progresses and never reverses. It is a ratchet. On their side, it may not even get started, and that's why you should side with negative.
All right, I'll acknowledge the negative reply. May I please request the affirmative reply to end the debate? Thank you.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah. Yes, you are. Yeah, please go ahead.
All right, thanks. So I think the neg case is just outright unreasonable. It is that they can vote and they can get all of their individual rights, but we can't even do so much to be able to create unions. I think that is precisely what this debate is about. It is the expansion of the possible protections for collective rights that we would have otherwise prioritized. So they can't just say our mech sucks. It's precisely because of status quo that our mech sucks, and we preferred a world where our mech didn't suck. And I think then that just contradicts so much of the second neg speech, where they say that they can still have unions, they can still have all the things they want because they have already historically existed. Not only is that missing the motion because it assumes that there was no priority put on these kinds of mechanisms, but more so, that means we can also co-opt voting, because this debate isn't just about a basic set of rights, but the ability to expand and access the rights that individuals must be able to have then, and expand the power and leverage that happens. 2 questions. Number 1, are these like ways that movements work far more inclusive on our side? I want you to take note. Whenever they're losing an issue, they just say it's symmetric. They have to learn what symmetry is, rather than looking at the more comparative analysis. Look at their assertive analysis. It is these movements are smart. They know what they want and they know what's best for their movement. It is disgusting to be able to assert that all white women know what all black women want, but it is precisely what I said at first half, to be able to say that movements now can only rely on resources and depend on the most privileged individuals who can exercise their individual rights for their movements to be able to coalesce, versus deriving power from collective bargaining, where you derive power from getting more members and must cater to more members, where you derive power from a voting structure, which at best they say privileges privileged individuals. Sure, but that also means these privileged individuals have to run on platforms that poorer and more vulnerable individuals must vote on, must get consensus on, and therefore there's still a greater incentive to cater to them. At best, they say they're geographically locked. That is a bad thing. Number 1, we already told you that it is impossible for you to assert your individual rights as an individual human being when you have little to no protection from things like the law, versus, and I would say here's the comparative, if this black individual from the deep south needed to be able to get some degree of recourse, it is far harder when you rely on the police rather than relying on the movement, which can at least provide you a safe space to be able to do it, or at the very least can give you a greater degree of leverage towards local governments in trying to ascertain these rights, rather than relying your own individual freedoms to assert and exercise your own personal leverage against incredibly large structures which only benefits the privileged. They literally never respond to this. At best, it's geography that is 1, symmetric, which they wanted to be able to talk about, but 2, even that geographical locking out is far easier to be able to change on our side, because it's easier to find and coalesce people who are from the same minority group than trust the law, than trust higher structures which never wanted to listen to you anyway. Secondly is on like goals, right? I think they ascertain that so many of the things that we talked about are rights. There is no right to a bathroom. There is no right to be like higher wage, and that's not just equal pay. It is literally being like given a higher wage than you already have, not being compared to someone else. So that's a flat thing, right? These things are not enshrined in the Constitution, which, if they rely on as a myth, denies so many of the other benefits that they say that are not enshrined within the Constitution then. And therefore, they can't just co-opt these things. When we said uniquely, collective bargaining is the way to be able to grant leverage over things that are not currently enshrined constitutionally as rights, and therefore is far, far better. Lastly, on change, I don't think they respond to any of my mech with regard to the legitimacy of the movement, while you make it seem more inclusive. And any like structure they say that is already inaccessible, number one, is already defeated by the policy to make it more accessible and movements giving it more emphasis. But number two, it's far less likely when you derive power from collectivization that you lock out more and more individuals. That's on their side, where you rely more on money and resources rather than collective bargaining. So I'd say then change is more likely to happen on our side and more inclusively. But moreover, they just assert that rights felt by the different social groups are the same. When things like your ability to get maybe a gender change is very different from the ability for Black individuals to be able to get greater police reform. The only binding factor between the possibility of these things is a right to protest, a right to strike and unionize, and exercise your collective leverage against this, not some random rights that they make up, which, if they rely on the Constitution, are things they're never going to be able to get. I'm very proud to propose.
All right, that acknowledges the affirmative reply. I thank both teams for a wonderful debate. Before we just head off, may I please know the motion veto?